It really makes you think, when we're all striving for a just society, how do we balance actually catching those who break the law with making sure their rights aren't trampled on in the process?
Absolutely.
It's a question that comes up all the time, especially here in the Philippines, and sometimes the answer isn't so clear-cut.
Right. And what happens when, let's say, there are slip-ups, mistakes in the legal process?
Yeah.
Could those actually become the reason why someone accused of a serious crime ends up walking free?
Today, we're diving deep into a Supreme Court case that sparked a lot of debate across the country.
It did.
It's a case where the fine details of legal procedure, the nitty-gritty, really took center stage.
It's a fascinating one. We're looking at People of the Philippines versus Pilar Burdeos y Oropa.
Okay.
The case number is GR 218434.
Got it.
And this was decided on July 17th, 2019. Our mission today is to understand why the Supreme Court ultimately decided to overturn the lower court's decisions and acquit Ms. Burdeos.
Right. She was originally convicted of selling illegal drugs.
Right.
That's correct. Dangerous drugs.
This deep dive, it's really a window into the complexities of the legal system, Sometimes it works exactly as intended, and sometimes, well, things get a bit messy.
Absolutely.
So, to really grasp what happened here, let's start with the facts as the prosecution presented them.
Okay.
This whole story unfolded back on August 19th, 2008 in Muntinlupa City.
Right.
The authorities were conducting what they called a buy-bust operation.
Yeah.
And their target was Pilar Burdeos y Oropa.
Now, this operation, it was supposedly set in motion by a tip-off.
Oh, interesting.
A text message, actually, received by a chief superintendent, alerting them about some suspicious drug activity. So the Anti-Illegal Drugs Task Force, they jumped into action and placed Mrs. Burdeos under surveillance.
So they were watching her.
Based on what they observed during that surveillance, they decided to move forward with a buy-bust operation.
Okay, so walk us through how that buy-bust actually went down. What did the police say happened? All right, so they assigned police officer Eddie Guevara to go undercover as the poser buyer.
Right, the one who pretends to be interested in buying the drugs.
Exactly. And he had backup Pio Rondevar Hernaiz, who was right there with him.
Okay.
Their testimony was that Pio Guevara, he went with a police asset to Mrs. Burdeos' house, approached her right there in front.
Yeah.
He was pretending to be like a taxi driver.
Oh.
And he told her he wanted to buy shabu.
Shabu, that's the street name for methamphetamine here, right?
That's right. Crystal meth.
Okay.
And so they claim there was some negotiation back and forth about the price, and eventually Mrs. Burdeos handed him a small plastic sachet.
This is where it gets a little tricky.
It does.
Because that sachet, it supposedly contained just a tiny amount of ephedrine.
0.03 grams.
0.003 grams.
Yeah.
And in exchange, Pio Guevara gave her P500.
Right.
Now, according to the prosecution, right after this exchange supposedly took place, Pio Guevara, he flicked his lighter, which was their prearranged signal to the rest of the team.
Like, okay, we got her. Let's move in.
Right,
Yeah.
It's a go. So the rest of the buy-bust team, they rushed in and arrested Mrs. Burdeos.
Pio Hernaiz, he testified that he immediately informed her of her constitutional rights, the right to remain silent, that sort of thing.
Right, very important.
And he said they searched her and found the marked buy-bust money.
Okay, so they're claiming they caught her red-handed. But what about the actual drugs, the ephedrine?
Well, their story is that they took that back to the police station and only then marked it, inventoried it, and photographed it.
With Ms. Burdeos present.
Yes, yeah, they said she was there. And there was also a civilian named Dennis de Lumban who witnessed the whole thing.
A civilian, okay.
And then, of course, they sent it to the crime lab for testing, and a lab report later confirmed that the substance was indeed ephedrine.
So that's the prosecution side of the story. But as we know, there's always another side.
Always.
And in this case, the defense presented a completely different account of what happened that night.
Mrs. Burdeos, she completely denied ever selling any drugs. Her version of the events was that the police officers, they just showed up at her house, accused her of being a drug pusher, and then proceeded to search her entire house.
And did they find anything?
Well, according to her, they didn't find anything illegal, but they still took her to the police station.
Wow.
And she claimed that they tried to pressure her there to give them names of other drug pushers, which she couldn't do because she said she didn't know any.
So it's her word against theirs?
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
Her grandson, Dijon Reyes, and her daughter, Lilibeth Janaman, they both testified to back up her story.
Oh, interesting.
They were there when the police searched the house, and they said the officers really went through everything.
Clearly.
But they found nothing, absolutely nothing incriminating.
So we have these two very different narratives, two very different versions of events. What did the regional trial court in Muntinlupa City make of all this?
They had to weigh both sides, and they ultimately sided with the prosecution. They found the testimonies of those two police officers, Pio Guevara and Pio Hernández, to be more credible, and they handed down a guilty verdict against Miss Burdeos.
And what was the sentence?
Life imprisonment and a fine of P500,000.
Wow, that's a heavy sentence.
Yeah. Essentially, the trial court, they were saying that the buy-bust operation was legitimate, that it was all done by the book.
So for Ms. Burdeos, was that the end of the road?
No, not at all.
Okay.
She appealed the decision, and the case went up to the Court of Appeals.
So another layer of the judicial system.
However, the CA, they agreed with the RTC.
They upheld the guilty verdict.
They did. They said there was substantial compliance with something called the chain of custody rule.
Now, I'm guessing that's really important in drug cases.
It's super important. It's all about making sure the evidence was handled properly, that it wasn't tampered with or anything like that.
That makes sense.
Right, from the moment it's seized to the moment it's presented in court.
Right, right.
The CA, they also relied on that presumption that police officers, they're supposed to do their jobs correctly, right?
That they're following the rules.
So at this point, we have two levels of the court system that have found Mrs. Burdeos guilty.
So what happens next?
Well, that brings us to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court.
The final stage of the legal process.
And they were faced with a really critical question.
What was it?
Did the prosecution in this case actually follow the proper procedures when it came to handling that tiny amount of seized ephedrine?
We're talking about that 0.03 grams.
Right. Did they comply with what's known as Section 21 of RA 9165, the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002?
So that's the central issue before the Supreme Court.
It is. And if they found that there were errors, missteps in handling the evidence, then they had to decide whether those mistakes could be excused under the so-called saving clause in the law's IRR. It's implementing rules and regulations.
Okay, so after all that, what did the Supreme Court ultimately decide?
Well, they did something pretty dramatic.
What was it?
They granted Mrs. Burdeos' appeal.
Really?
They reversed the Court of Appeals decision and acquitted her.
So she was set free?
She was.
Why? What was the reasoning?
The Supreme Court, they found that the prosecution had failed to establish a clear and unbroken chain of custody for that seized ephedrine.
So that trail of breadcrumbs we were talking about, it was broken.
Exactly. And if even one of those breadcrumbs is missing, it raises doubts about the whole process.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at these broken links in the chain of custody as the Supreme Court saw them. What was the first issue they identified?
The very first one was about how the drugs were handled initially, right when they were seized.
Right at the scene.
The Supreme Court pointed out that those 0.03 grams of ephedrine, they weren't marked right there at the place of arrest.
Uh-huh.
Both Pio Guevara and Pio Hernández admitted that the marking happened later on when they were back at the police station.
So there was a delay.
And the court emphasized that this delay, it created an opportunity for something to go wrong. Like, the evidence could have been switched, planted, contaminated, who knows?
Right, right.
And importantly, the buy-bust team, they didn't offer any explanation, any justification for not marking the drugs immediately at the scene, as they were supposed to do.
So that was strike one. What about the next step in the process?
The second link involves the inventory and photographing of the seized drugs.
Okay.
Now, Section 21 of RA 9165, it's very specific about who has to be present for this to be done correctly.
There's a protocol.
It says that this has to happen immediately after the seizure, and there have to be witnesses.
Okay.
The accused person, of course.
Right.
A representative from the media.
Okay.
A representative from the DOJ, the Department of Justice.
Uh-huh.
And an elected public official.
So quite a few people.
The idea is to have these independent witnesses there to ensure transparency so everything is above board.
So what happened in Mrs. Burdeos' case? Were all those people present?
Well, Pio Guevara, he admitted that he wasn't even sure if the required representatives were there. And Pio Hernández specifically said that the inventory and photograph were witnessed only by Miss Burdeos and that civilian we mentioned, Dennis Lumbin.
So not all the required witnesses were there.
No.
And the Supreme Court, they really focused on that.
They did. They pointed out that the prosecution didn't explain why those essential witnesses were absent or why they used a civilian instead.
That's a pretty big oversight.
It raises questions about whether the proper procedures were followed to really safeguard the evidence.
So just having that one civilian witness wasn't enough.
Not according to the law. The law very clearly spells out who needs to be there.
Okay.
And the fact that there were no representatives from the DOJ, the media, or an elected official, that was a major red flag for the Supreme Court.
Makes sense.
It suggests a lack of adherence to the very safeguards that are designed to protect the process.
Okay, so that was strike 2. What about the other steps? The transfer of the evidence, the lab analysis, all of that.
The third link in the chain of custody is all about the transfer of the drugs. So you've got the arresting officer, and it should go from them to the investigating officer and then eventually to the forensic chemist at the crime lab.
So there's a clear path it's supposed to follow.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, they highlighted some inconsistencies in the testimonies of Pio Guevara and Pio Hernández. They couldn't quite agree on who actually had possession of the drugs at different points in time.
Like from the arrest to the police station to the lab.
Exactly. And these conflicting accounts, they created another break in that chain. It's like, well, if we don't know for sure who had the drugs when, how can we be absolutely certain that they were handled properly the whole time?
Right. It casts doubt on the whole thing.
Exactly.
And what about those final steps, once the drugs reach the crime lab and then the court?
The Supreme Court, they really zeroed in on the lack of evidence from the prosecution about what happened at the lab. They wanted to know who received the ephedrine at the lab.
Right.
How was it stored? How was it preserved while it was there? And finally, how was it presented to the court as evidence?
All crucial questions.
Absolutely. And the prosecution, they didn't provide any evidence about these steps.
So that was like strike 4 and 5.
Pretty much.
So with all these procedural errors, what about that saving clause in the law?
Yeah, the implementing rules and regulations of RA 9165, they do have that saving clause.
So there's a bit of wiggle room.
In theory.
Okay.
It basically says that even if there's some non-compliance with these strict requirements, it might be okay if there were justifiable reasons for it.
Right.
Like something unexpected happened, but they still managed to preserve the integrity of the evidence.
Okay.
However, and this is a big however, the Supreme Court stressed that for that saving clause to apply, the prosecution have to explain why those procedural lapses occurred.
They can't just ignore them.
Exactly. And in Ms. Burdeos' case, they didn't provide any justifiable grounds for those multiple failures to follow the chain of custody rule.
Okay, so that saving clause didn't save the prosecution's case.
It didn't.
What about the argument that, we should just presume that the police did their job correctly?
That came up too, right?
Yeah. Didn't that factor into the lower court's decisions?
It did. But the Supreme Court, they addressed that head on.
Okay.
They said, yes, there is a legal presumption that law enforcement officers are doing their jobs properly according to the law.
Right.
But they made it very clear that this presumption can't replace actual compliance with the rules.
Especially when there's evidence that the rules were broken.
Exactly. Especially when, like in this case, there's clear evidence of those breaks in the chain of custody.
Okay.
The presumption of regularity, it's not an automatic get-out-of-jail-free card.
So ultimately, this case wasn't really about whether Mrs. Burdeos was guilty or innocent of the crime itself.
It was much more about whether the prosecution had followed the proper legal procedures when handling the evidence.
And they didn't.
They didn't.
This case really highlights how important it is to get those procedures right, especially in drug cases.
It's a reminder that every step matters.
It protects the integrity of the evidence, but also the rights of the accused.
Exactly. Even in cases involving dangerous drugs, you can't cut corners.
Those procedures, they're not just technicalities, they're there for a reason.
They're safeguards.
This whole case, People versus Burdeos, it really makes you think about how committed our legal system is to ensuring a fair trial.
It's a testament to the idea that due process and the rule of law, they have to be upheld in every case, no matter what.
No matter how serious the charges are.
The Supreme Court's decision, it's a reminder that shortcuts, even if they're well-intentioned, they can have serious consequences.
They can undermine the whole system.
We'd love to hear what you think about this case, What parts of the chain of custody rule strike you as the most important?
Head down to the comments section and tell us what you think. Or hit that favorite button if you found this deep dive into People versus Burdeos insightful.
Let's also recap some of those key legal principles that were at play in this case.
Great idea.
First up, you've got the chain of custody. We've talked about this quite a bit, but it's that step-by-step process for handling seized drugs to make sure the evidence is reliable.
It's like a paper trail, but for physical evidence.
Exactly.
And then there's the concept of corpus delicti.
Which literally means body of the crime.
In a drug case, it's the drugs themselves.
The prosecution has to prove that what's presented in court is the same stuff that was seized from the accused.
And if the chain of custody is broken, that becomes a lot harder to do.
Much harder. Then we have the presumption of regularity.
Right, the idea that we assume law enforcement is doing things by the book.
But as we saw in this case, that presumption can be overturned if there's clear evidence that something went wrong.
And finally, there's the saving clause.
That clause offers some flexibility, but the prosecution has to prove they had good reason for any deviations from the standard procedure.
And they have to show that the evidence is still reliable. If you're interested in exploring more landmark legal cases and understanding how